Hello, Hack in the Box. Sorry I couldn't be there, but the most regrettable thing, as you'll see from this presentation, is that I couldn't be there to capture all of your Bluetooth data, because I'm sure there's lots of interesting and unique to Thailand data that I'm not going to be able to get as a result. Anyways, let's roll. So these days I'd perhaps be best described as an educational philanthropist because about 75% of my very expensive time is spent making 100% free as in beer, open access, and open source classes for a nonprofit I started called Open Security Training 2. This is the successor to the earlier hobby project of OpenSecurityTraining.info, which helped a lot of people back in the day, and those people eventually went on to pay it forward by becoming OST2 instructors. But about 25% of my time is the typical consulting and research, and the research is for my own fun, but it's also a Trojan horse to get me into conferences to tell you about OST2. So, what do I want to know in this research? I want to know what Bluetooth chip is inside any given device. So, you can have all of these various devices, but the question is, which chips are inside of them? Now, I happen to know that Texas Instruments is used in Teslas, Broadcoms, and iPhones, Silicon Labs, and Nest cameras, but if I have any random device, how do I know what kind of Bluetooth chip is in there? Well, you say, why would you want to know that? Well, why I want to know it is because I want to know if that particular device is vulnerable to a firmware-level exploit. So Armis led the way previously with the bleeding bit vulnerability, where they could send a packet and compromise the firmware of Texas Instruments. My wife, Veronica Kovah, also found vulnerabilities on Texas Instruments firmware that could be exploited without authentication over the air. Researchers in CIMU Lab at the Technical University of Darmstadt in Germany had found vulnerabilities in Broadcom firmware, and my wife also found vulnerabilities in Silicon Labs firmware. So the point is, for all these types of exploits, there are always pre-authentication vulnerabilities where just by being in Bluetooth range, you could break in and compromise the firmware, and subsequently, depending on the architecture of the chip, maybe that gives you everything you need, or maybe you can then pivot and take over the application processor. So these vulnerabilities are super interesting, but the problem is no one knows where all they apply. Nobody knows where the Broadcoms all are, or Silicon Labs, or Texas Instruments. So how am I going to figure this out? Well, in great Socrates fashion, the first thing is to know that I know nothing. Second thing is to collect a bunch of Bluetooth data, just naively, just collect whatever's out there and see if that helps tell me anything. And a third, find out what I don't know. Now, when it comes to hardware that I had on hand when starting this project, I had a few choices. There was the Raspberry Pi Zero, which is the cheapest option and has only half a gig of RAM. Raspberry Pi 4, which are still pretty cheap, and they come in 1, 2, and 4 gigabyte versions. I had a 1 and a 4 gigabyte. And then the BeagleBone Black Wireless. It was $72 when I got it. Looks like they're more expensive now, but they're also out of stock everywhere, so I'm not sure that this is useful for other folks. But the big important thing about this is that it had an antenna connector. So anyways, when it comes to price, the clear winner is the Raspberry Pi Zero, but I wanted to see whether or not this BeagleBone Black would actually collect more information with its antenna. So I did various ad hoc experiments over time where, for instance, I would be sniffing with two devices at the same time, and so for instance, the Pi Zero caught 113 named devices to only 65 named devices by the Pi 4. So I'm not really sure why that is, and I haven't dug into it too much. I've also done tests comparing the Pi 4 to the BeagleBone Black with an antenna connected, and it turned out that they actually caught the same number of devices, so that was kind of surprising. So the clear winner here on collection was actually the Pi Zero. And I also did some tests to see how long these devices would run off of the same battery pack, and the clear winner here, once again, was the Raspberry Pi Zero. So it is the all-around champ on price, collection, and battery runtime. But why do I need something that runs for 90 hours, multiple days at a time off of a single USB battery pack, right? I can't be up for 90 hours sniffing continuously. So I've learned rather than drive to the Bluetooth devices, I let them drive to me. So I found that if I lock a box up near a freeway, I can collect between 10 and 16,000 named devices over the couple days that the Raspberry Pi Zero's battery affords me. So while you just see a traffic jam, I see a bunch of beautiful Bluetooth devices just waiting to be scanned. Now, when it comes to my software setup, there's nothing special, there's nothing late. It's basically just a bunch of bash scripts around Linux command line tools with Python scripts to parse my data. At one point, I did try to go make a C-based BlueZ dbus API MySQL direct insertion application, but it was taking too long to make, and I only got a subset of the data that I was getting out of the command line script, so at this point, I pretty much don't even use it because these CLI tools are much more reliable than my little tool. All right, so now I need to give you some of the basic Bluetooth background information that you'll need for the rest of this talk. When it comes to BD adders, Bluetooth device addresses, BD adders, we're going to see a lot of those. When it comes to Bluetooth classic addresses, they look essentially like this. So I'm borrowing some slides and images from a particular website. Unfortunately, they put the most significant bit here, but these 24 bits in a BD adder are the IEEE Organizationally Unique Identifier, OUI. And if you're familiar with MAC addresses, this is basically the exact same thing. So these upper 24 bits uniquely identify a company. Bluetooth Classic didn't have any notion of randomization, and so these were unique per device, and these could be a mechanism by which you could track devices. Now, Bluetooth Low Energy did have some notion of randomization because they wanted to make it so that it was harder to track people. So the first type of address you have is a public address, and that is exactly the same as Bluetooth Classic. It has an OUI, and it is trackable. Next type of address you have is called a static address, and it is trackable because it depends on the randomization interval, but most of the time it is assigned and fixed for the lifetime of the device. So the thing about this is the most significant bits are going to be 1. So this is going to either have an address that starts with hex nibble, F or E or D or C. If you see that as an address that's marked as random, then you know that it's a static address. And actually these most significant bits are the only way that you actually know whether it's static or resolvable or non-resolvable. But again, this type is trackable. The next type that is ostensibly not trackable is called the resolvable address. The most significant bits are 0, 1, so you're going to see 7, 6, 5, 4. And it basically just has a mechanism where if the two devices share a key, then they can create the same sort of hash and know that they're talking to another device that has the same key as them. We don't care about that. We just care about the notion that resolvable addresses theoretically change over time and consequently should be harder to track the device behind it. And finally, there's the non-resolvable address. Most significant bits are 0, so that'll be a hex nibble of 0, 1, 2, or 3, and the rest is all random, no significance to the rest of that. Now, when you see output like this in my presentation, you're looking at btmon output. This is one of those Linux tools that can collect log information as well as go read it later. So if you see something like that in bold, it's saying it's public, that's going to be a trackable address. In this particular case, it's also telling us it's got a name, and that name happens to be exactly the same as its BD adder. On the other hand, if you see output like this is just from one of my scripts that is used to parse the database entries after I post-process all of the information that I get from the Linux command line tools. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Wiggle. Wiggle is a crowdsourced infrastructure for Wi-Fi sniffing and stumbling and capturing information, crowdsourcing it, uploading it to the internet potentially if you want. They don't do it by default, but if you want, you can upload it, and then you can have nice visualizations like this. Originally, it was for Wi-Fi only, but they added Bluetooth support in 2019. I bought an old $50 junk Pixel 3 that I like to run Wiggle on, and I always bring it along with me while I'm doing my other Bluetooth sniffing because very frequently the Pixel will be able to pick up GPS where my GPS module for Linux does not. Unfortunately, Wiggle, although they support Bluetooth, they don't have most of the data we would want to have for Bluetooth, and a lot of the data I'm going to be digging into further in this talk. But one thing that I think is worth mentioning is that while it is originally for Wi-Fi, in my short period of time using Wiggle, and this is actually old data, I actually saw an order of magnitude more Bluetooth devices than I saw Wi-Fi devices. So there are way, way more Bluetooth devices out there than Wi-Fi. And actually back in 2004, Herford and Mulliner, in their blueprinting paper, said currently the actual number of Bluetooth radios in use is 4 times higher than the number of Wi-Fi radios. So in 2004, it was a 4-to-1 ratio, and now it is greater than 10-to-1. This again, I think, just speaks to the importance of getting our hands around the Bluetooth wireless vulnerability problem. So I want to talk to you about some anecdotes of different things I've seen at different locations around the world. Before the pandemic had actually started, I already had plans to leave my job at Apple in the Bay Area and move back to my house in Maryland. You can make great money out in Silicon Valley, but then you also have to spend all of that money if you want to own a house, and I already owned a house in Maryland, so I would rather just move back and work remote. But then the pandemic happened, and instead of taking what was supposed to be a leisurely drive down through the south of the United States, visit New Orleans and other states that I've never visited before, instead it turned into a pandemic cannonball run, because we basically just booked it as fast as we could across the country in order to get home and not have to, fly on a plane or anything like that. Now this is the just GPS route information, not the Bluetooth devices. Here is the Bluetooth devices, just to make it a little more easy for you to see. And so basically you can see that kind of like chunk at a time, we made our way across the US, and I clearly didn't have GPS data for here. I did get the Bluetooth devices, I just don't know where they are located. I should also probably say at this point that I didn't know that Wiggle collected Bluetooth data yet, so I hadn't found that yet. That's why I didn't have the redundancy of being able to collect that data through Wiggle as well. So then because I knew this trip was coming up, I knew I needed to get a Bluetooth sniffer into a state where it could work across the country, and I wanted to make sure I could get all that data, because how often do you drive across the entire country? So I just, sniffed around in the Bay Area. This is the GPS trace. This is the Bluetooth sniff data. Moving on to a little bit of leisure travel. Last spring, I took a road trip down from Washington down all the way to Florida and the Florida Keys. So if you're going down to Florida, of course, you got to stop by Disney World and sniff the Bluetooth, and that's exactly what I did. So this is all of my data only, so Wiggle lets you sort it down to say, show only devices that you were the first to see. So this is just my data, and this is all Bluetooth devices, including devices that don't have names. If I filter that down to only devices with names, I see quite a few less, but when I look at those names, I see one recurring thing that appears a lot, something called Disney Mbole. If I filter it down to that, you can see that's almost all of the data was Disney Mbole. Going back and looking at all the Wiggle data, not just mine, we can see there is a ton of these Disney Mbole things. Zooming out, you can see that they're also at all the various different Disney parks. And I actually stayed at one of the Disney resorts, and you saw the Bluetooth devices there as well. But what was interesting is you could see them specifically along the roads. And so one possibility is that maybe the buses and shuttles that take you to the resorts have it, but the more likely answer was that these magic bands are beaconing. Now, I briefly thought it wasn't the case that those were beaconing because the data had this big gap here on the Jungle Cruise, for instance. But now I've decided that gap is caused by the biases of Wiggle users not going on the Jungle Cruise, because when you zoom out to the entire world, you see that the world is covered in Disney Mbole. It's all over the United States. There's some in Disney Tokyo, as you might expect, but there's not any in Disney Hong Kong, for instance. And also Paris is strangely devoid of them, while the United Kingdom somehow has them. So basically, I'm inclined to think that these Disney parks in Paris and Hong Kong just haven't used this access control mechanism with the Bluetooth enabled yet. Moving on to hacker conferences. Netherlands, The Hague. Hardware.io 2021 got there, found out that my sniffer, the Raspberry Pi, would straight up not boot, and I didn't have the necessary stuff to fix it. So in 2022, I came with more redundant sniffers and made double sure that it was working. Now here's some GPS data, and you can see that it actually doesn't capture from within the hotel. Again, as always, the Pixel catches the GPS data much more effectively than my little USB GPS dongle. So what's interesting about Hardware.io is it's the first time that I actually noticed flipper devices. So we're going to come back to the flippers later, but they are a definite signal that hackers are around. Now let's talk about my most recent location data coming from Ring 0 and DEF CON in Las Vegas. Here's the overall data, and then here's the splat coming from the Palms Hotel. So I was doing a training there, and I had my sniffer up against a window because, again, I wanted to get GPS, and so this is just the splat of all the GPS locations being inaccurate for this window mounted thing. Obviously, there was all sorts of sniffing going on in here, but I didn't have a GPS signal. Similarly, at the Caesars Forum, where DEF CON was held, I was sitting probably right about there, nearby the exit, and so this is just the splat of all the GPS data when I could actually get it. Most of the time, couldn't get it. And here's the Wiggle view of just my data from Vegas. Obviously, you can see way more data from other people. So over 4 days at the Palms, I saw about 1,300 unique named devices. There were also 7 flippers in that, which again, flippers kind of seem like they're a secret signal that there's hackers around. But I would say one of the most interesting things that I saw at the Palms was things advertising as pay range. So their normal advertisement was pay range, but if you sent a query and said, "What's your name?" then it would say, "My name is Blue Radios," and then some 6 digits, 6 hex digits, which happens to correspond to the last 6 digits of the BD adder. Additionally, some, instead of saying they were Blue Radios, would say Blue Key Pay Range. So what is that? Well, Googling it, Pay Range is a company that offers vending machine services, and Blue Key is some sort of dongle that probably gets plugged in on the inside of the vending machine. So how their architecture works overall is they convince vending machine vendors to plug the dongle in, they convince you to download their app, and then you create an account, put some money in the account, and your app talks to the dongle, and the vending machine dispenses that sweet, sweet candy. The other thing that's interesting about this particular device is that it identifies by its BD adder and manufacturer-specific data as having to do with something called Blue Radios Inc. You look that up and you see that they are a Bluetooth module maker, but actually the reality is that their Bluetooth module is someone else's chip. So it's a Nordic chip as far as I'm concerned for purposes of finding out whether or not there are vulnerabilities that apply. So there's a mini takeaway here, and that is if you're able to identify the presence of a Bluetooth module maker, a specific module maker, that will give you a set of possible chips that could be used in their modules. And which Bluetooth chip a device has is what I want to know. Most module makers only use a couple of different chips, so it definitely down selects from the possibility space of all possible silicon makers to just whatever you can find on the module maker's website. And when it comes to DEF CON, I can't actually tell you how many devices I saw only at DEF CON, because again, GPS data is very unreliable inside of buildings, and also I ran around the Las Vegas Strip sniffing devices every morning, so I can't go based on just timestamps necessarily. So while I was walking around in Las Vegas, I happen to usually have Bluetooth scanning apps up on, so I can see if there's anything interesting as I'm walking around, and then stop if I see something I've never seen before and just hope that my Bluetooth sniffer will eventually see it and query it and get additional information above and beyond what I can get from these sniffing apps. And when I wandered into the Wynn Casino area, not just the Wynn, but actually the casino area, all of a sudden a whole bunch of things popped up called IGT card reader. And those looked something like this. IGT card reader, and then manufacturer name, IGT, model number, and hardware revision string. So that's pretty interesting. What's IGT? Well, IGT is a gaming machine hardware maker. So they make things like these virtual slot machines, which are essentially just really glorified computers with multiple screens. And indeed, you can actually buy parts from them. They have a store, and for instance, they have a Bluetooth module that you can buy. Now, the thing is, you have to log in to see prices. You can't log in unless you have an account. You can't get an account unless they vet you. So I don't know that I'm ever going to be able to buy one of those kind of things. But hey, if you've got an IGT account and you'd like me to check out their Bluetooth modules, maybe you should get in touch. All right, digging further into what is IGT and what's up with this IGT card reader thing, eventually found a document that basically showed this nice and obvious thing where it's talking about the player taps the Bluetooth sensor with their phone. So they were essentially talking about a mechanism where instead of having to have cards that have the stored value of, how much money you're gained or lost while you're playing the games, instead you just have a virtual card that's on your phone, and then it communicates to the Bluetooth reader via very close. So it says taps the Bluetooth sensor. And this actually jives with what I was seeing from the IGT card reader because it says it has a transmit power of negative 72 dBm. That's extremely low, and that's the kind of thing you would only expect to go like mere centimeters or, inches, that kind of thing. So that's why you're tapping. You're not tapping because it's like NFC or something like that. It's because it's extremely low Bluetooth power. Anyways, besides Win, where are these IGT card readers advertising? Well, there's a whole bunch of them at coordinates 00 on Wiggle, which is, again, why you should always not necessarily believe the stuff you see on Wiggle. Anyone can submit any data to Wiggle. This shouldn't be used for, forensic investigations or anything like that. Anyone can submit any data, and in this particular case, they submitted erroneous data. But other places that we see, well, there's the Win on this map of Las Vegas in paradise. And then there were 4 locations named very similarly: Texas Station, Palace Station, Boulder Station, and Sunset Station. So it kind of makes sense that a company that's running multiple casinos would potentially be using all the same sort of technologies. But then elsewhere we saw it at Palms and Bellagio and Aria and Park MGM and Virgin Hotels and MGM Grand and Luxor and Mandalay Bay and Green Valley Ranch. Now, the real big question here is, are they supposed to be advertising like this, or are they misconfigured? And to that, my answer is, shoulder shrug, I don't know. This bears future investigation, don't you think? So in fall of 2022, my wife and I, having been fully immunized and not having gotten COVID at any point, decided to take our chances and go on vacation to Korea. So that allowed me to collect some data from Seoul, take a train ride down to Daejeon and meet with a former professor, Youngdae Kim, head down to Jeju Island, which is the Hawaii of South Korea, with a big old volcano there, and then head up to Busan before taking the train back. So in Seoul, I'd already been to a lot of the touristy stuff in the past, but I figured it'd be good to run around and collect some data in Gangnam, just because you never know what kind of new and interesting devices they might have there. One of the types of scooters you can only find in Seoul, not even the rest of South Korea, not anywhere else in the world, is called kick going. So it advertises as just plain kick going. And so I thought that was interesting because we can have geographic data that is isolated to specific countries, but you can also have it isolated to specific cities. So those are public, infinitely trackable, but the interesting bit here is the fact that it advertises with a OUI of Expressive. So Expressive is a silicon chip maker, a Bluetooth chip maker. So the mini takeaway from that is that sometimes a device which is using Bluetooth Classic or BLE with a public address can have an OUI which is from the chip maker rather than the company that's actually making the device. And so that should give you a pretty strong signal of which chip the device is actually using, and which chip a device has is what I want to know. Cool, so I got some more of that information. Another interesting thing I saw while looking around in Seoul is something that advertised as KFTC Bank POS. And so KFTC is a nonprofit organization which manages several interbank payment systems in South Korea. So it's a bank point of sales terminal of some point. Now, I always read this like KFC, but that's neither here nor there. So looking at this data, what's interesting here? Well, it just calls itself KFTC Bank POS, but I happen to see that in other devices, they didn't have any name, but they had the exact same UUID available. Now, this is a UUID that's embedded in an Apple iBeacon manufacturer-specific data. So if we go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, we can see that they look the same. Now, the thing about names in Bluetooth Low Energy is that sometimes the name will be in these advertisement indication packets, adv-ind. So an advertiser will just be spewing out these adv-ind packets at certain frequency, and so a completely passive scanner can find some information in there. And sometimes that information will include the device name. But other times you have to actually explicitly request it. You send a scan request packet, and you get a scan response back. So in this case, you can see that this KFTC actually came from a scan response according to querying my own little database. So that means, for instance, if you're just rolling by really quickly and the thing gets out of range, you might send a scan request, but you may never actually get the scan response back. So that's why it's very interesting that this adv-ind includes this iBeacon data that basically exactly tells us that if you ever see exactly this string, then it is or it's a byte string to be clear. This byte string indicates that this is probably a KFTC bank POS. I mean, it's possible that someone else came up with this same 128-bit value, but unlikely. The mini takeaway from that, of course, being that parsing those iBeacons, which are very ubiquitous, and extracting these UUID 128s could be useful for identifying unnamed devices, but you may now actually know their name from some other instance where you scanned and successfully captured a name from a device. Another place I stopped in Korea was Daejeon, where I went to KAIST, the Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, to visit one of my former professors. One of the things in that data that popped out to me was this thing called IVT, and then when I looked into it, I couldn't really quite figure out what it was. So I'm looking at it and I can see, okay, it's public, whatever it is, it's trackable. I can also see that it advertises a transmit power of 8 dB, which is relatively powerful. That'll give you a decent amount of range. And then the only other information I had was that it has an OUI of BNCom. So I look up BNCom. What do? Well, they are a company that sells Bluetooth modules. So looking at the BNCOM Bluetooth modules, I then went and looked at every other device that had BNCOM, just in case there were maybe some similar patterns or something I could pull out. I did come up with these other devices called BCM LN300s, and those looked very similar to these modules they sold called BCM LN100 and 200, but literally on their product page, they have no product called BCM LN300. So based on these ones, I can see that that's an NRF one, whereas this one, this other module with a different naming convention is CSR, Cambridge Silicon Radio, and this is also NRF. So we might imagine that this BCM LN300 is also an NRF device. But we don't have to imagine, that's what the FCC database is for. So things that transmit over radio waves have to be certified for use in America by the FCC, and they also have to send in information about what their modules look like. So we've got this little module, which we can enhance, and then we can enhance once more. There we go. Look at that. That's the magic of modern technology. Anyways, the mini takeaway from that is that those internal photos pictures can be used to identify chips in some cases. Which chip a device has is what I want to know. Let's transition from location-specific anecdotes to device-specific anecdotes. So I could tell you how Tesla Model 3s and Ys are trackable by their random static BD adders, their names that never change, but there's a much better presentation by Martin Herford, which I recommend you check out instead. Now, it's worth saying that Tesla Model 3 was just hacked via Bluetooth this past pwn to own, but it's also worth saying that that is not a novel attack surface, and Keen Lab hacked a 2017 Lexus via Bluetooth back in 2020. Now, Rivians show up like this, and they are public, so they are trackable, and while the Texas Instruments OUI was not available in BTMon, it is available in my tool, so we know which chip it uses, and the FCC database chef kiss has a perfect example of that. For those who are interested, here's a bunch of other car things, and they're almost all Bluetooth classic, so they're trackable, with Polestar being the exception, but they happen to be using a public address in Bluetooth Low Energy. What about surveillance cameras, the ubiquitous Nest cams? Now, sometimes they just identify as Nest cam, but other times they have these names like N and then A to Z, 0 to 9, and 4 of them. So first of all, they have random BD adders that are resolvable. So finally, we have something that's theoretically not trackable, except, of course, it has this static name. So if you move houses and you take your Nest cams with you, the Wiggle database might show where you've moved to. So these names, as I said, have this, regex have this particular pattern, but that pattern is kind of too generic. So, we might infer based on that, like these, maybe it's an incrementing number, and so N0037 is like the 37th one ever sold. And so we might ask, like, where is nest number 1? Let's go look in the Wiggle database to find nest number 1. Well, from the Wiggle data, if we look for N0001, we can see that nest number 1 lives in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. Great, Minnesota, that's where I'm from. Oh wait, or maybe it's in Japan, or maybe it's in England. Well, the problem is that the Wiggle data right now doesn't tell us what this N001 is. That actually a Nest cam, or is that just some other random device? And that's where having this 16-bit UUID would have been helpful. So this is FEAF, and that corresponds to Nest Labs. So with that 16-bit UUID, you can say, okay, this device is definitely a Nest device. And without it, you just have to go based on the name, and this name can lead to false positives. So the mini takeaway from that is that those 16-bit service UUIDs are useful that are advertised on the device. They're useful for associating products with vendors and to differentiate between different products with similar names. Flippers. Oh yeah, remember those? I said I saw them at hardware.io in the Netherlands. So I'm not entirely sure why these things are beaconing all the time. Maybe they're just trying to do it when they're trying to find other flippers. I don't know. I don't have one of these. The reason I don't have one of these is because when I looked at their specs, it says that its transmit power is 0 dBm. So that is extremely low. That's not going to be useful to me. Using the official Bluetooth range estimator, if we have transmit power of 0 dBm, if we're inside of an office, for instance, that's about 15 to 21 meters of range in which you can see one of these things. So anyways, that's just, even if I could create some sort of hacking tool and put it on there, they are physically limited by the actual chip on the device. They're not going to be useful for Bluetooth hacking anytime in the future. Not until they change the hardware anyways. Or perhaps I should say, not unless you want to really snuggle up with your target. So anyways, the regex on flippers is just, it starts with flipper and then it has a randomized name. So have you seen it? Now you have. These are some examples of flippers that I saw at hardware.io and previous stuff. This doesn't include all the various dozens of flippers I saw at the recent DEF CON and Ring Zero. But for instance, I was looking through all of these and then I was just putting them into Wiggle one at a time. And this one popped out, this flipper Ironiu. Well, it turned out Wiggle had seen that particular thing that I saw at hardware.io outside of a Panera Bread in Peachtree Corners, Georgia, which is just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. So maybe this is a way to backtrack all those hackers that show up at hacker conferences with their little flippers doing all their cool stuff and then accidentally giving away where they live. Anyways, like I mentioned, the BD adder is public on these, and the name is also non-randomized. So Googling around, you can see that there's actually forum posts asking to change the flipper name, and the response is, nope, the name is written into OTP, one-time programmable memory, so it's not possible to change it, but you can change it, you can edit the firmware to read the name from a string instead. So yes, later on in that thread, someone gave an example of change the code here, and then you'll just read some other hard-coded string name. So hard-coded string name's not exactly going to be good for stopping this thing from being tracked over time unless you're literally rewriting your firmware all the time. So anyways, there's a ticket out right now that says, please make us less trackable, and someone filed that in November 2022. And so until they close it, until they change the BD adders to be randomized, until they change it to not be advertising a hard-coded string all the time, till then, flipper folks, I see you. Moving on, during my cross-country pandemic Cannonball Run, there was another hotel that I did see that seemed to have a bunch of devices that were enough that there were probably one per room. Now, at the time I looked at this, it's just a sort of random looking number, just 8 digits and 8 digits, and there was no real association between any of these digits and like the BD adders or room numbers or anything like that. Now, the door itself physically looked like this. And, this is just some door I found on the FCC website and decided, yeah, that looks about right. And specifically that it mentions using Bluetooth Smart, which was the earlier name for Bluetooth Low Energy. So it's saying that this door, beyond using contactless RFID type stuff, it can also use Bluetooth to open the door. Now, when we look at the OUI on this, it comes up as GE Security. So that seems about right because we're talking about door locks. So it makes sense that there would be a security company. And then furthermore, it also is advertising a 16-bit UUID that came up as UTC Fire and Security. So that might be a little more specific of the company, or the company UTC may have been bought by GE Security, don't know for sure. But then at this point, what we can do is search Wiggle with a regex searching for just this OUI and see where else we see it. So we see it all over the country. Drilling down on some random location, I didn't actually pick it, I just literally zoomed in wherever and came up with Charlotte, North Carolina. So drilling into the individual hotel level, we can see that this Hilton Charlotte Airport has a bunch of devices that are being advertised with this particular OUI, and they have a similar naming convention, just 8 digits, period, 8 digits, similar to what we saw at the Country Inn and Suites in West Virginia. So indeed, if we just look, we zoom out a little bit, we can see the DoubleTree is here, the Hilton Charlotte Airport is here, the Embassy Suites by Hilton Charlotte is here, and they're all things that are using the same technology, which makes sense. Now, actually, at Black Hat 2019, there was already a talk about breaking into hotel suites via doing some sort of attack on Bluetooth. They didn't say the exact hotel suites that they were targeting, and they said it was in Europe, so maybe it's the same, maybe it's different, but this is just to say that there has already been related work on breaking into Bluetooth-based hotel suites. And now at this point, to speak to the somewhat provocative statement that I made in my abstract for the talk, does using Bluetooth locks open the door to assassinations in hotels? I want to tell you where I'm coming from. So there is this really good write-up from 2010 that goes through there's a YouTube video that goes along with it where they basically analyzed a bunch of security footage from a hotel where a Hamas leader had been assassinated, killed in his hotel. And so the expectation is that this was probably done by Mossad. And so they show, the Mossad people coming in and out. But the interesting thing here is at the time of execution, it says there was an attempt attempt for entry via reprogramming the lock on the door. Now, this particular attempt, they show the logs and stuff like that, and they say that the operation failed, so they're not actually sure whether this succeeded or whether the assassins just actually social engineered their way into the room. I mean, literally you can just knock, and if someone opens the door, you can push the door open, but you can see the point is there was an attempt, right? An attempt was made to get into someone's hotel room at and around the time of assassination via what, is just the typical magstripe reader type thing. So I don't think it's too far of a stretch to say that if these Bluetooth devices are having firmware level vulnerabilities where someone just walks up to it, exploits the door lock, and can just open the door, well, then this opens up the opportunity for these types of people who do these types of close action activities to continue to have their way with hotel rooms and the people they're in. Let's go from something dark to something light. In case you didn't know, there's a thing called Pokemon Go Plus, which is just a wristband that vibrates when there are Pokemon around. You click the button and you capture the Pokemon. Don't even have to take your phone out. Fun times. Now, Huawei watches, Samsung watches, and Fitbits are all eminently trackable. But the thing that I want to say about Fitbits is more about the use of their vendor-specific 128-bit UUIDs. So there are the 16-bit ones that we've seen before, but there are also 128-bit UUIDs in Bluetooth. So we have UUIDs like this one, which were seen associated with the Versa, Versa 2, Versa Lite, Ionic. Then we have this one, which is the Inspire, the Flex 2. This one, these two, which are associated with the One, this one, which is associated with the Flex. And they're all always advertising these things. And so you can start to see some patterns here. So for instance, these four right here are all the same except for the underlined portion, but they're also different from what's used on these particular models. So for instance, I've talked to you before about there's advertisements and there's what's advertised may not include a name. So this device has no name. But we said that it can be advertising information or you can get the name back in a scan request. So even though I don't know the name of this particular device, I can tell based on the 128-bit UUID that it's one of these models. It's a Versa or Versa 2, a Versa Lite, or an Ionic. It's not one of these models. So the UUID in some sense becomes a proxy for a model or at least a set of models. So then there was a simple test I could do where I basically just took btmon, I read a file, I grepped it for the ending portion of one of those 128-bit values, and I found all of the devices that were associated with that 128-bit value, even though I obviously just chose a subset. And so actually it turned out that I had gotten these names as I was building up lists of names that I knew what they were. I knew what an Alta HR was, I knew what a Flex 2 was, Inspire, but these things, Ace 2, Ace 3, Blaze, Charge 2, Charge 3, I had not yet actually associated those as being Fitbits. I just, in my list of stuff I know about, stuff I don't, I hadn't done that yet. So the mini takeaway from this is that 128-bit service UUIDs are useful for associating products with vendors, even if they don't have a human-readable name. So even if you don't see a device advertising as an Ace 2, you could still know that it could be an Ace 2 based on a 128-bit value that is advertised all the time and which is collectible even by a completely passive scanner that doesn't have to ask, hey, what is your name? This can also associate, different similarities across product lines and how, one generation of product is similar to or dissimilar to the next generation of products. And that can then give you a sense of, well, is the firmware changing a lot or a little? The developers, at least went out of their way to change the UUIDs. That may not necessarily mean that firmware is changing in any meaningful way, but it's telling you certainly the developers did more work than these other products that are all, extremely similar to each other where they didn't even bother to change the UUID. When it comes to cars, there is an extremely common class of devices that are essentially adapters between this ODB2 diagnostic interface and Bluetooth. So basically people will plug something into this ODB2 port, which historically, Auto Mechanic would plug in a little reader and it would understand the various codes and stuff like that. And then they would, know what the check engine light or something like that means. Now these days, people plug these things in and then it sends the data directly back to your phone, and consequently the phone app can tell you what's up with your car. The first one of these that I ever saw back in California was called Fixed, and it was kind of interesting because I just used one of the random Bluetooth scanner apps to attempt to connect to it, and it seemed like it actually successfully connected. Now, the car was off, and so I couldn't see any actual data, so I don't really know whether it had completely no authentication, and I would have been able to see stuff if they started. But yeah, that was kind of interesting to see. But there's a whole bunch of these devices going by a whole bunch of different names. Some of them are, quite possibly white label things where they're just generically called ODB2. And the thing is, because the ODB2 port has direct access to the CAN bus, that would be potentially a concern, right? If someone could break into this device and all of a sudden they could send arbitrary CAN bus messages. We know from car hacking security that, depending on how good the car manufacturer has done, the capability to send arbitrary CAN bus messages could allow for things like unlocking the car, or it could allow for actually starting the car if they're a particularly bad manufacturer. But I'm not the first person to think of that. There is past work here from Usenix 2020, where they basically looked at a whole bunch of these ODB2 adapters and saw, what kind of vulnerabilities existed. And indeed, there were a bunch of very simple vulnerabilities in these things. So I've talked a little bit about tracking people via their watches or their cars, and I think there's an important analogy to be made here. It's becoming very common to use things like automated license plate readers in order to see when and where people are going. Whenever someone is carrying on them a Bluetooth device that is not actually randomizing its identity, then a Bluetooth scanner can serve much the same purpose as an ALPR. Now, there's definitely a big difference in that license plates map one-to-one back to households or individuals, but in the context of criminal cases, you can understand how the police might want to place someone at a scene based on something like Bluetooth data. So that would be an example of surveillance when you have the authority doing the tracking, but there's also the concept of surveillance, which is when the public tracks information such as keeping authorities in account. Wiggle is actually an example of surveillance. And speaking of keeping authorities to account, let's take a look at body cam data. Specifically, we're going to look at a Panasonic camera. It goes by TW370 and then 3 digits alphanumeric and then 5 digits numeric. And so, just Googling this and trying to figure out what it is, well, I found, on eBay that we had things that were advertising TW370, and then they had something like QKA041437. So this is a Panasonic body-worn camera. Looks something like this. And so this is essentially what we normally think of as a police camera, something that they would wear on their body. So I Googled this, but I had a pretty good intuition that this probably was going to be some sort of police device because I knew from my GPS that it was at a location. I had driven past that location the same day, and there was a police officer who had stopped someone at a very uncommon location, not somewhere that's even really safe for someone to stop normally. So I knew exactly what was there at that location. It had to be something to do with police, and then Googling around found that it's a body cam. Now, these particular body cams turn out to be using public BD adders and associated with Panasonic OUIs. So that means these are going to be trackable. So within my county, I can clearly see that it's, my county specifically, which is actually using these devices because I can see in the Wiggle data that they're very geographically tightly focused on my county and not in surrounding counties. I think an interesting question to ask about these sort of body cams is it only broadcast if it's recording or is it configurable? So there's oftentimes, a lot of controversy about, if police turn off their body cams at times that are inopportune for not actually capturing, something important that went on. For instance, turning off the camera before some sort of misconduct. So it would be an interesting question of, can you tell whether or not the police have their body cam on or off based on this sort of broadcasting? And I don't know the answer to that right now. My intuition is that it probably is only broadcasting when it's specifically flipped on. That intuition is based on the fact that I've, driven past the police station and I don't see a whole bunch of these things all the time. I only tend to see them when I see police out and about. And there's another fresh talk on this topic that just came out at this past DEF CON, where they're looking specifically at Taser, or Axon, which is a company that bought Taser. They make a ton of police equipment, including body cams, and basically this DEF CON talk talked more about the particular infrastructure that Axon has and how they have, recording devices in the cruisers and things like that, and how they use Bluetooth beacons in order to signal that, video recording should commence and be uploaded to evidence and that kind of thing. For what it's worth, I know that I have about 520 devices that are advertising with OUIs that are public OUIs of Taser in my dataset. And now we get to medical devices, the things that make you go. For instance, this Dexcom continuous glucose monitoring system. So these systems are worn on the body, typically such as the arm. And by worn on the body, I actually mean they're stabbed into you so they can suck your blood. And they pair between this device, which reads the glucose measurements and sends it back to a device like a standalone device or to your phone. So anyways, these Dexcom devices have a random static address, so they're trackable, and also they're always advertising in those adv-ind packets that there's a Dexcom device here. So it's saying, hey, we got a glucose monitor here, hey, diabetic right here, hey, check it out, diabetic person. Yeah, so that's not exactly great. And if you were ever unclear that the thing named Dexcom was actually a Dexcom glucose monitoring system, well, they handily advertise a UUID 16 that also says it's the Dexcom company. And if we go look down a little further, there's also this manufacturer-specific data, which also says it's Dexcom. Now, there's raw data here of 3703, and I don't know what that means, but it's kind of interesting that they have so little customized data. If you look at the other devices, they have similarly only 2 bytes of data, so I'm kind of curious what that is. But the basic point is going to be for all these medical devices, digging in further is a research project unto itself. Next, we have a insulin pump by Tandem Diabetes Care called the T-Slim X2. Now, I'm guessing that this ***611 is that it's going to be the serial number, but I don't actually know. If I had one physically in my possession, then I would be able to tell that pretty quickly. Now, the reason that you're seeing this insulin pump shown at the same time as this Dexcom is because basically the Dexcom continuously monitors the blood glucose level, and then it sends that monitoring to the T-Slim, and the T-Slim actually has the insulin pump, which then directly injects insulin into the person when they see that the glucose is going too high. And even though it goes without saying, I'm going to say it anyways, if someone can hack an insulin pump and or just send it incorrect readings, you don't have to actually compromise this device. If you can send it incorrect readings and get it to start pumping out insulin, well, then you can go ahead and put that person into a coma as they get too much insulin injected into them. Now, this particular device is trackable with a random static address, and it says conveniently that it is Tandem Diabetes Care. Now, we go down further, we can see I actually have some GET information for this. So I only recently started collecting GET information. Usually when you're looking at devices in the phone applications and you say, like, get additional information about the device, it's actually using GET. GET is the generic attribute profile, which runs on top of a protocol called the attribute protocol. Anyways, it's just a way to get a bunch of information from the device. So for instance, we can see down here that there's a type of information called device name, which has the exact same device name as it advertises up here. So basically, then once you can collect GET information, it's just a question of figuring out, what is the individual type of field, like device name, appearance, peripheral, preferred connection parameters, and then, figuring out some of those are going to be standard. So these initial ones right here, these are all standardized ones. They have well-defined meanings. But then you can also have non-standard ones. So I'll tell you this one down here, this FDFB, well, that's actually that 16-bit UUID from before. So this is some custom Tandem Diabetes Care thing. And so I don't know how to talk to it. I could, fiddle around and try to collect information. But that is, because this one right here was device information, this is probably a way to get additional information as well. So this was one of the first medical devices that I ever found because these things are all over the place. This is the Philips Responics System 1 CPAP. A CPAP is a continuous positive airway pressure device, and it treats sleep apnea by providing continuous positive airway pressure. What does that mean? It means it's blowing air up your nose while you sleep. So what we can see about this device is that it's actually advertising both via Bluetooth Classic and via Bluetooth Low Energy. So anytime you've got a BD adder that is available via Classic, that is definitely trackable. And so why not go ahead and call it a public address as well for Bluetooth Low Energy. One other thing is that it actually advertises that it has a serial port. So what kind of interesting things can you find if you connect to the serial port? I don't know, I didn't try. But what I was more interested in when I saw this kind of device is the link between sleep apnea and poverty. Specifically, it's a link that sleep apnea is directly correlated with obesity. So there is a linear correlation between obesity and OSA, or sleep apnea, from citation 1. And there is a link between poverty and obesity from citations 2 and 3. So the question I had was, okay, I can run around and see all of these CPAP devices. Are there going to be more of them in neighborhoods that are poorer or richer? So, poorer neighborhoods should have higher rates of sleep apnea, but they wouldn't necessarily be able to afford these Bluetooth sleep apnea machines. So which do you think it is? Do you think the rich neighborhoods are going to have it, or do you think the poor neighborhoods are going to have it? So here is the Washington, D.C. area and the distribution of these particular Philips CPAP machines. Here is an overlay of income averages. I believe this is by zip code, but I actually lost the link for where I got this from. But anyways, let's call it zip code based overlay here. So we can see in the Washington, D.C. area that it is this southeast area that is the poorest, so lowest income. There's also a big blob of poor right here, but that's a location called College Park, so I'm pretty sure it's just the college students pulling it down. So in general, super rich over here in Maryland and Virginia, and very poor over here. There's this county right here, Prince George's County. That is one of the poor counties. So that's the income distribution. Think poor over here and go back to this. Well, it looks like that is not the highest frequency. We've got plenty of things in here in DC. We've got plenty of things over here in the rich neighborhoods, but not so much over here. So again, income distribution like this, and it looks like it's actually inversely correlated. So poor people cannot afford the fancy Bluetooth sleep apnea machines. Who would have thunk it? But still, I wanted to see. Now let's switch gears to heavy machinery. So CAT. BTNT. These are devices that you'll see associated with heavy equipment. So when I Googled around for the CAT BNT, I found this thing. This is the Bluetooth network transceiver, and it says these messages are sent over the CAN data link to the machine control ECM to enable operator identification. So that's already super juicy. It basically means that you've got this box that is the magic gateway between Bluetooth, so something saying, hey, I'm a Bluetooth key, and then it turns it into CAN messages, which again, from car hacking, we know that those are the kind of things that can allow full control of the system. So in this particular case, I knew that this was probably going to be a construction machine because on my pandemic Cannonball Run from California back to Maryland, passed through Virginia right here, and I knew based on this location that there was road construction there. There's a whole bunch of road construction on this Route 66. And so when I see something called CAT, well, I'm from rural Minnesota. I know that CAT stands for Caterpillar, and it's heavy equipment. So I found these sort of documents that were available saying, hey, we've got this transceiver. So what's it transceiving for? Well, it's transceiving for this little key fob, which is the actual Bluetooth device. So then you go Google around, you find some videos about how do you, pair those key fobs with the CAT device. And the video says, introduce the MAC ID key code. And it says type in this thing. There's this thing called a MAC ID. And when you Google that, you see that 506583 is actually the OUI for Texas Instruments. Great, now I know that it's using Texas Instruments chips. And indeed, all of the CAT devices that I saw in my dataset are all using public TI BD adders. So it's trackable. Oh no, I can track you by your heavy equipment. And those videos also conveniently show that the same BD adder is listed on the back of the key. So anyways, let's say that, like me, you now wanted to go off and hack this device. What would you do? Well, you go to the FCC website, you look at those internal photos, you get lucky and you find out that, yes, it looks like it has a Texas Instruments 2541 chip, which corresponds to the fact that everything was using Texas Instruments public BD adders. Great. Then you pull up the datasheet for the CC2541, you start looking around that. Then you go buy yourself a dev board for the 2541 so that you can play around with that at your leisure. But it's not good enough to just play around with that. You need to get an actual device. And yeah, heavy construction equipment is super expensive, so you're probably not going to buy one of those for over $100,000. So you go looking on eBay to see if someone has one of those transceivers, but there's no hits for CAT BNT. But then you accidentally find this page, and this says that this is Caterpillar keys. So, and they work for loaders and skidders and pavers and tractors and excavators and compactors and dozers. And you look down there and it says it's compatible with all of these models. And you say to yourself, wait, what? These eBay keys that cost $8, $9. These things are compatible with basically everything under the sun. Well, that seems like that's going to help us get in the cockpit, so that's great. So this eBay thing, if we look at it really close next to the FCC image, next to the user manual image, we can see that they really look like they're all cut exactly the same. So it seems like kind of every cat device in the world is using the exact same key. And at this point, I'm sort of feeling a little bit like, wait, why should I bother hacking a Bluetooth-enabled device when I can just steal any other non-Bluetooth-enabled device with a single key that's available for $9? This is how I felt the most. So it's probably possible to steal expensive construction equipment with the Bluetooth exploit. The security baseline for construction equipment is actually very low, and it's super easy to steal them with cheap universal physical keys. Well, now I'm not hacking it. Yes, indeed, this killed my entire exuberance for wanting to hack and stunt hack a construction equipment. But then I got to take off my black hat and put on my security architect hat and look and think and say, you know what? Actually, this is a net security improvement. If basically everything in the world is stealable with those physical keys, then now the fact that you're forcing an adversary to actually do some sort of Bluetooth attack means that you've really, really, really raised the bar. Because, even if it takes someone just a week to hack it, that week worth of someone's time is going to be hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. And consequently, that is a much more expensive attack than the $9 buy a key off eBay attack. So that's why us security people have to not just always get narrowly focused on like, oh yeah, this is totally cool, I'm going to hack it with Bluetooth. And you need to consider the full threat model. So that's the end of our device-based anecdotes. I went ahead and packed up your takeaways for you to remind you that Bluetooth sniffing goals are different from Wi-Fi goals, and consequently, the sniffing tech is underdeveloped to help with those goals, right? So Wiggle is great. It's awesome that we have all of this data available to us, but it's missing a whole bunch of data that we need to really drill down and, confirm things about which vendor is this or see things about manufacturer-specific data. And again, when there's a Bluetooth firmware bug, no one knows what all it affects. There's a lot of devices out there that have no human-readable name, so we don't know what they are, but that's the continuing effort of my upcoming research. And there's a lot of devices that are advertising names, but we don't know what they are. And this is the kind of thing where crowdsourcing can really help us, because if you've physically got one of these, you're probably going to know what it is. So we need to come up with ways to capture this kind of information. So this is my final call to action. Join me, and together we can rule the Bluetooth galaxy. But more concretely, Wiggle's Android app is open source, so if you know Android development, it would be great if you could work with me to help translate between what Bluetooth researchers need and what Android's development environment can provide. Also, I'd like to crowdsource more of this information that is not easily extractable, the things like which device corresponds to which name, but my webfoo is weak, and therefore, if you happen to know how to create something like a website where we can allow for wiki-like contribution that still leads to stuff being put into a backend database to allow for easier querying and more structured data, I would definitely appreciate help with trying to build out that kind of system. And the most important thing is that you go out there and collect some information and share what you find. My data will be available to other researchers on a share and share-alike basis, so you've got to go out there and collect some data to share to me, and then I'm happy to give you my data as well. So in conclusion, I started this work knowing that I knew nothing, but what do I now know that I didn't know back then? Well, basic Bluetooth sniffing of the form that I've mostly done over the last 3 years can sometimes give you information. For instance, when you've got a BD adder that's either classic or BLE public, then it's going to have the OUI. And if that OUI is a silicon maker like Texas Instruments or one of those other silicon makers, that's a pretty good indication of which chip you're using. Additionally, that kind of information about silicon makers can pop up in those 16-bit UUIDs or the BT member company IDs. But what I also know is that some of that information is available according to various things in the spec, but it's not actually exposed through things like the Linux BlueZ stack. I could actually see with raw sniffing that some of the information is queried via BlueZ, but then it's never exposed in this HCI log, in this log of information that I actually capture and parse. That means I have to go out and collect it myself using customized setups. And the one downside of that is that that's not exactly going to be scalable. We can't do that through every single digital phone app. And that was where that preview of my upcoming work on tooth printing comes in. So this is basically collecting the kind of information I need from, for instance, in this case, LMP, that's a low-level Bluetooth classic link management protocol. There are pre-authentication packets you can send to request information, and some of that information is going to tell me potentially which silicon vendor is actually used by the device. So what do I now know? Well, when I was looking at the basic Bluetooth sniffing, I now know these are not the data I'm looking for. Stay tuned for the upcoming research. So Bluetooth security research is cool, but open security training too is cooler, and that's what I spend most of my time on. We'll have some Bluetooth classes eventually by myself and Veronica and potentially other instructors. But in the meantime, there's all sorts of classes on reverse engineering, vulnerabilities, firmware, system architecture from myself and a whole bunch of other folks who were beneficiaries of Open Security Training 1 and who are now paying it forward by being instructors for OST 2. So you should go check it out and take a class, or potentially, if you've got the chops, maybe you should teach a class as well. Well, thanks for watching my video. The full video is actually about twice as long as this. Had to really chop it down, have too many examples. So you can follow me on Twitter to find out when I actually release the director's cut, coming in at 2 hours long. But until then, hope you have a good rest of your con.